So there's this part of tech that I love, and it's this idea that tech is open to anyone. I mean, you can build your own computer out of cheap parts, and you can teach yourself to hack before you finish high school, and then you can get started building these innovative products that really change our society for the better. But there's this other part of tech that I haven't loved, and it's these things that have to do with our industry, this idea that our industry is not always welcoming to all kinds of people, and that tech is also responsible for things like deepening class divisions and social inequality. But what if we took everything we knew as engineers about how to solve problems and drive change, and we applied it to ourselves? You know, we have this deep divide right now that it's at an all-time high, where over here you have people expressing outrage about sexual harassment and discrimination in this industry. And then over here you have all of these engineers who can't seem to figure out how to solve the problem, and they just kind of keep their heads down and keep coding. But what if we harnessed all of that energy and all of that talent, and we used it to make the tech industry better for all of us? You know, when I was growing up, I only knew about the good parts of tech. So my dad is in appliance sales and repairman. He's someone who grew up working with machines. And when I was 5, he bought this Apple IIe, this early Apple computer. And he brought home this giant box, and there's little 5-year-old me in the kitchen, and we unpacked this thing, and neither one of us had any idea what to do with it. But to him, it was just like a dishwasher. I mean, you get out the manual and you read about it, and that's just what we did. And the two of us taught each other how to code. And so then we moved that Apple IIe all over the country. I lived in 5 different states and 7 different houses and as many schools before I turned 18. And every time we moved, it was like I was parachuting into this new land where I had the wrong clothes and I didn't talk the way everyone else talked. Or I'd moved from one school where it seemed like no one was dating to a school where it seemed like everyone was. And, you know, all that, I remember spending what seemed like an entire year in middle school actually studying this game of jump rope that seemed essential to female friendships at this school that I had moved to. And it was almost had to be an anthropologist studying every aspect of it. There were these rhymes and these jumps and you know, and then sometime in the middle of that year, I realized I also had the wrong clothes. You had to have these all-white tennis sneakers and these really expensive colored scrunchy socks. And it took me forever to put all of this together because there was no manual for that. And there was no one there who was willing to explain it to me. And the harsh truth about this is that, you know, none of those people at that new school needed me as a friend. Like, they already had friends, and the person who needed friends was me. And so that loneliness, it really motivated me to reach out and talk to people who were different from me. And I think this is the experience that a lot of women have in the tech industry, where you're just kind of automatically different in a lot of the spaces that you move in tech. And the thing is, you know, so it's always been a little bit harder for me to adapt to these situations in tech. But I couldn't just stand around and wait for the tech industry to reinvent itself around me to reflect the diversity of America. You know, I didn't have time for that. It's not fair that this was harder for me, but it's also not fair that I had to move to Cherry Hill, New Jersey in the 1st grade. I mean, you kind of end up where you end up, and then you try to make the most of it. But all that stretching, it also made me kind of hyper-aware of the differences between people and the differences in how we treat each other. So, you know, this is another experience that women have in tech. It's like this thing happens that seems a little bit off. It seems a little bit different from how others are treated. And you wonder, did that happen because I'm a woman? And you can never really quite tell. I mean, a couple of months ago, I went to this business conference, and I introduced myself to someone as the chief technology officer at Redfin. And the person looked at me and they said, "Oh, did you come up on the business side?" And then about 30 minutes later, someone had the exact same reaction. And, you know, I started coding when I was 5. I worked my way all the way to a chief technology officer role, and yet people still sometimes assume that I'm not technical. And I know there's many great leaders in technology who did come up through the business side, but it's hard for me to imagine that male CTOs get this question a whole lot. And you know, maybe it's no surprise, because when you Google chief technology officer, I mean, these are the kinds of images that you see, you know? And like almost none of them look like me or like many of us in this room. And this sort of unconscious bias, it's everywhere in tech. It's this unknown X factor. And it just contributes to this feeling that the tech industry is somehow fundamentally broken. And we know, sadly, that many women leave the tech industry as a result of things like unconscious bias and much worse behaviors that happen. And so people often ask me, how did you survive in this industry for so long? And there isn't just one answer. I mean, some of it is luck. I've mostly had the opportunity to work with people who were really supportive, like some of the people who are here today. And then maybe because I got involved in tech when I was just a little kid and I love technology so much, it might just make me kind of willing to put up with a lot. But there's this other aspect, which is that the way that I approach something that's broken is to try to fix it. My dad could get the most broken, janky dishwasher running again if he just had the right part and if he diagnosed the right problem. And even if a dishwasher was just completely lying in pieces, he had this eternal optimism that we could get it running again. And it's made me this diversity mechanic. When I see diversity problems, I want to go in there and I want to tinker with them. I want to rejoice in that satisfying click when you put just one piece back in place, even if you have more work to do. And we're at this watershed moment in our industry. More and more people are coming forward to tell their stories like they've never told them before. What was it like for Susan Fowler at Uber? What was it like for the women entrepreneurs who tried to seek capital from Binary and Dave McClure? More people are recognizing that we have a problem, but no one seems to know how to solve the problem. We don't know how to solve it for individual women in tech. We don't know how to solve it at our companies. We don't know how to solve it for our industry. But this is what engineers do. Other people talk about problems. We solve problems. We get in there and we figure it out. And the best engineers know that the way to get to the right solution is to work with other people, to mix and match our ideas until we get to the right solution. And so this is our conference's mandate today. No one is allowed to get on stage today and talk about a problem without also proposing a solution or asking for help. Because we can only talk about a broken dishwasher for so long. Like, this is our dishwasher, and it's a beautiful dishwasher. It's a magical dishwasher. It can do things that no dishwasher in the history of dishwashers has ever been able to do. But it's broken. It's really freaking broken. And now we are going to get in there and fix this thing. And so today, I'm going to talk to you about some of the things that I've learned as a diversity mechanic, where I've applied these techniques to myself to help my own career. I've applied them also at our company, working as a diversity mechanic to make things a little bit better there. And I'm also going to talk about some of the things we're doing at an industry level, some of the things where we think that we can make a real difference. So one of the first things you learn as a mechanic is that you have to choose the right tools for the job. I can't tell you how many times my dad and I made a special trip to the hardware store because we didn't have exactly the right piece of equipment that we needed to get something done. And this concept applies also when you're talking to other people. Like, what is the right tool for this job? Are you trying to advocate for something? Are you trying to convince someone of something? And I remember a couple of years earlier in my career, I was sitting in this dreadful meeting that was going on, and I had this really heavy workload. And my goal at that moment should have been to find a way to just politely leave this meeting so I could get back to doing my work. But that's not what I chose to do. Instead, I decided to look at my watch, and I just sort of said, and it felt good for about half a second, and then I realized that everyone else in that room had seen how disrespectful I'd been. And then I had to apologize, and the worst part of it was that at that point, there was no way for me to gracefully leave that meeting. I mean, I had used the wrong tool for this job. And so in our age of Twitter, people have really gotten used to this idea of expressing outrage that doesn't really accomplish anything. It's the equivalent of looking at your watch, and you can get this echo chamber that says, yeah, I agree with you, but it doesn't really get anything done. And so today when I'm talking to some other person, I almost have these massively parallel calculations going on in my head where I'm saying, what is my goal right now? Am I trying to tell a joke to ease the tension? Am I trying to look into someone's eyes so that they know that I really care about them? Do I need to slow down my voice to make sure that we really understand each other? And can I predict how the person is going to react to what I say or do? And I think it's almost easier to learn these skills when you're different because you get to run all of these experiments about how your words affect other people. And so the next concept is this one of continuous improvement. I really believe in the perfectibility of the human being, and even of myself. And I think that's helped me survive in an industry where we seem to believe in continuous improvement for some kinds of people, but not for others. I mean, if you're this hoodie-wearing college dropout, we seem to have this endless faith that you're going to be able to learn and figure things out. But if you're not, we almost write you off. And this applies also in our industry. People like Travis Kalanick or even Ryan Lochte in their 30s and 40s, they were considered to be just some young men who had some growing up to do, and we just need to help them out. But if you're a 35-year-old graduate of a developer boot camp and you're not ready on day one to check in production code at a company, we kind of can write people off. And I think Silicon Valley has really made this effect worse by worshiping this sort of Steve Jobs, you're either born with it or you're not mentality, this idea that talent is king. And this isn't just about boot camps. This is about also people later on in their careers who hit the so-called glass ceiling, that you can't get past a certain point. In my early 30s, I was told that I just didn't have that strategic thinking capability, that I wasn't providing that strategic thinking that was going to be needed to get me to the next level. And it didn't seem like anyone was willing to help me through that. It was kind of just like, okay, you're a great engineering manager. Why don't you just kind of stick with that? And I'm sure there's other people who will figure out strategy. But the thing is, I was unstoppable. I decided that I was going to break strategy into all of its little pieces. Like, what is strategic thinking? What was it that I was missing? What was I not doing? And I asked for help from other people on how to figure that out. And then eventually I did figure it out, and I started coaching other people on how they could develop their strategic thinking. And many of those people were from diverse backgrounds. And then we turned that into a whole program that we use now at Redfin for people who are hitting the same barrier. And so just that change in mentality, that strategic thinking doesn't have to be something you're born with. It can be something that you can learn. It's unlocked the careers of so many people. And this idea that you have to ask for help, it's really core to developing yourself. And it doesn't stop when you get to the C-suite. I mean, last year I decided that I wanted to work more on public speaking. And so I got a public speaking coach, and I looked for more opportunities to be on stages like this one. And this year I've been looking into getting onto a board, which is something that's still a work in progress for me. So this idea, the more people are intentional about this, those are the people who really develop themselves. And so as I started taking on more and more leadership roles at companies, there was this point I got to where I realized, if something's broken at this company, it's actually now on me. I mean, I'm kind of calling some of the shots, and it's on me to try to fix these problems. And it made me want to be a diversity mechanic for our whole company. And another thing you learn when you are a mechanic is that if one thing doesn't work, you have to try something else. In the early days of computers, we used to program computers to do the same routine over and over and over. But then more recently, there's been this machine learning revolution. Now we write algorithms that learn, that optimize, that figure out what's wrong and try to get better. And this is something that applies to diversity initiatives too. There's a lot of diversity initiatives that seem to be more like those early days where we run the same diversity subroutines over and over. We decide to roll out unconscious bias training, and then maybe we recruit from a developer boot camp, and nothing really changes, but we say, okay, well, good effort, and we'll kind of, keep doing that and move on to the next thing. But when in Silicon Valley have we said that a problem is too hard, that we already tried something, it didn't work, so we're going to move on to something else? We are engineers. We should keep investing and keep learning. When I started at Redfin, I was the only female engineer. This is 6 years ago. I was the only female engineer on our Seattle engineering team. And today, I'm proud to report that 29% of our technology team is women. And many of them are here today, so... And it makes us one of the most gender diverse teams in the technology industry. And it took a lot of effort to figure out what had to be done there. But on racial and ethnic diversity, it's actually a completely different story. We've tried the usual things and we've seen the numbers tick up a little bit, but it hasn't really moved that much. And to some people, that's the sound of failure. That's like a dishwasher that just starting up and then it just sputters out and dies. But to an engineer, that's a sign that something might be working, that we're just getting a little bit of a response and we have to keep trying. And so that's what we're doing now on racial and ethnic diversity. And if anyone has ideas, we're welcoming those. We're looking at ways that we can change this at our company. Oh, and one other thing is that, as engineers, we should be used to working on our algorithms, working on improving things over long periods of time. At Redfin, we spent years trying to optimize tour scheduling. We spent years trying to optimize our home value estimates. And so this should be something that comes naturally as engineers, that we keep trying things. And so here are some of the things we're doing on racial and ethnic diversity. So first, we started going to boot camp programs and internship programs that specialized in underrepresented racial and ethnic minorities. But what we found is that there were actually more competitive companies at those places than there were candidates. And so then we extended our efforts to large land-grant universities that are known for having diverse student populations. Another thing we did is we defined our career ladders and our career development plans really clearly, and we're making sure that every engineer, including our diverse folks, has an understanding of what it takes to get to the next level. And then we've also introduced metrics and measurement at a lot of points in the process. So for example, right after we promote a wave of people, we take a look at what that did to the diversity makeup of our team. And so these are the kinds of things that we have to get used to in diversity, is to learn from what doesn't work, to keep trying. But when we first started working on diversity at Redfin, we were also really overwhelmed by this problem. We didn't know what could be done. And then we sat down and we said, all right, well, let's put all our ideas on the table. What are all the things that we could do? And we started realizing there were so many ideas that we actually needed to organize them into a backlog. So we pulled all the bugs and all the stories. We have this diversity and inclusion backlog. And right now we have 27 different people that are working on stories from this backlog. And the most surprising thing about this is how it helped to democratize these diversity efforts. It helped to get more people involved, turning passive engineers into active ones, because anyone can pull a story off of this list and start working on it. Anyone can submit an idea. And it's really helped us to scale our diversity efforts. And the last one to talk about at the company level is this idea of understanding the user story. There's this concept in agile development that before you build a feature, you need to understand who that user is. Who are you building it for? What is their problem? And what problem are you trying to solve? And this is something that applies to teams of people as well, that you have all of these people that have to understand each other so that they can work better together. And it's just like when we need men to adapt to women, or women to adapt to men, or Seahawks fans to talk to 49ers fans, or whatever you may have it. It's this universal problem of how we relate to each other. And we need to be able to talk to each other in a way that's direct, where we can tell someone that we need them to do something without just going and complaining to someone later on. We have to be able to work directly with each other on these problems. And it's almost like we're building this service-oriented architecture between all of the people in our company, where each person has their own API, and they log errors differently, and they log problems differently. And all of these people have to be able to work together. And this is something that we train people on at Redfin. So for example, if two people disagree, we ask them, we ask them to assume that the other person has best intentions, that they're coming at it from a place of best intentions. And then we ask people to restate the argument of the other person. And if they're arguing on Slack, we say, how about if you get up from your computer, walk over, talk to that person, look them in the eyes, and try to talk to them as a human being. Another thing we train people on is letting junior people speak first, so that they don't feel like they're going up against a more senior person. And these are just a couple of things we do. You have to build an inclusive culture. It takes work and training. You can't just say, everyone should just be nice to each other. That isn't enough. And then there's this idea of embracing the minimum viable product. So in this industry, we seem to have an idea that the minimum viable product for an engineer is someone who has a 4-year degree from Stanford and has taken all these difficult classes and done 3 internships. And that's the minimum viable product for an engineer who can work in our industry. But the thing is that doesn't make any sense. We should treat anyone who's interested in getting into the technology industry as a minimum viable product, as somebody that we should keep investing in, that we should keep experimenting with. We should keep making them better engineers. When I first started at Redfin, we didn't hire anyone out of dev bootcamp programs. And when we talked about it as managers, myself included, we were just really skeptical of it. We thought, we're going to have to do all this training for people. How are we going to handle that? I mean, they're not going to know all the things that we need them to know. But there was this sort of serendipitous thing that happened, which is that at the time we were growing, we had more and more interns and college hires starting every year, and we realized that we needed to train those folks. And so we built this series, this 10-course online hands-on modules with office hours, and it really helped to get our interns up to speed. It helped to get our senior engineers up to speed. And then we realized at some point that that was actually one of the missing links. We had built the training program that we would need to make ourselves accessible and create a great experience for people coming out of developer boot camps. And so now we've hired a number of engineers out of these programs. They're making great contributions to our code base. It wasn't all that hard to train them, and they're helping us to make an even more welcoming culture going forward. And so now I want to switch gears and talk about solving problems in our industry. And there are a lot of problems in this industry. And so our approach has been to pick just a handful that we think we can make a real difference on, where we think that we can have an impact. And that's what I would encourage all of you to do at your companies, is just to pick 1 or 2 issues that you care about where you can start to get involved. So for us, one of the first ones has been to try to fix the pay gap in our industry. So a couple of years ago, we decided to start doing a formal analysis of the pay gap and the difference between how men and women are paid in similar roles and for similar levels. And we didn't find any statistically significant difference when we did that analysis, but we still decided that we wanted to put ourselves on this rhythm where every compensation cycle we were going to do this analysis, and where we would publish the results publicly to try to encourage other companies to have that same level of transparency. And so more recently, we started looking at, is there other data that companies could use to try to advocate for change at their companies? And we just did this really interesting study with PayScale, and we'll be releasing a full report on this next week, but I wanted to preview some of the data that we found. So we asked ourselves whether at companies with fewer female executives, there was a larger pay gap than at companies with more women executives. And it turns out that that is exactly the effect, that the pay gap is half when there are more women executives, with women earning 98 cents on the dollar compared to men in similar roles versus 96% at companies with fewer female executives. And the changes also apply to things like customer or employee satisfaction and whether people are reporting that they're going to be looking for another job in the next couple of months. These effects are also, they're better scores when you have more women executives. And so I guess the moral of this story is that if you want to be paid fairly, maybe you ought to join a company with more women executives. But there's another factor in here, which is that as all of us become leaders at our company, as we go through our careers, we can see ourselves as someone who could help to make this change, to advocate for working on the pay gap problem at our own companies, and we have a potential to really make things better. And the other topic that we've decided to work on at Redfin is how we diversify boards. So back in 2013, when Twitter was going public, the New York Times wrote this article asking why there wasn't a single woman on Twitter's board. And this caused a lot of soul searching in the industry, and we started to hear more about women being appointed to the boards of companies when they were about to go public. And so we decided to do a study last year to see whether there was any meaningful change, and it turns out that there is. We looked at the last 100 tech companies to go public, and we found that the rate at which women are being appointed to these boards has tripled. It's gone to 1 woman for every 2 men last year, and that was just because someone asked the question, why is it this way? And so we started saying, well, do we see any similar change at early stage tech companies of early stage boards? And unfortunately, the answer there is no. We haven't seen actually any movement on the boards of early stage companies. And we think the reason for that is that early stage companies, their boards are made up mostly of investors. And the investment community is not very diverse. According to Fortune, 94% of the decision makers at venture capital firms are men. And so then we said, well, all right, is the venture capital community diversifying? Because that would be a way to diversify these early stage boards. And it turns out that there we're seeing progress as well. The rate at which women are being appointed to venture capital firms, that has also ticked up. And so it's really great to see these numbers moving in the right direction, but it's going to take decades before we see parity at venture capital firms, which means it's going to be even longer before we diversify startup boards. So we said, is there anything else that we can do? And so today, I'm really proud to announce that we are launching a new initiative called Diverse from the Start. And this is in partnership with DFJ, Madrona Venture Group, Greylock Partners, Pioneer Square Labs, and also the board advisory and software company BoardSpan. And what this initiative is that these venture groups have agreed to commit to asking all of the companies that they invest in to appoint one independent board member within 2 years of funding. And what that's going to mean is that for the first time, these early stage boards are going to have one spot that they can recruit from a much wider pool of talent that goes beyond the venture community. And we think this is incredibly important. We've been lucky at Redfin to have several women serve on our board. Emily Melton in the early days, Selena Tabakawala, and Julie Bornstein now, who are going to be speaking later. And we feel like that's set our company on a whole different trajectory. So we're really excited about this initiative. We're inviting other investment firms to join us, and we'll be reporting more on this as we go through launching it. And so we've talked today about how we can be a diversity mechanic for ourselves, for our companies, and for our industry. But the last thought that I want to leave you with is that you also have to know what doesn't need to be fixed, what isn't broken. You know, I started coding when I was 5, and so I got these really early experiences with tech that made me fall in love with it. And by the time I started hearing that tech wasn't for girls, it was just much too late. I was already hooked on this industry. But that doesn't mean that it hasn't ever been hard. I mean, it was hard to be the only woman at the computer state competition in high school. It was hard to be one of only 2 women on a floor of 150 engineers at my first internship. When I first decided to go into management, I got advice that maybe I had to just stick with coding because I was so good at that. But that could have just been another way of saying that I didn't fit the image that people had for an engineering manager. And then when I decided to have kids, well, you won't believe the number of opinions I got about that. There were people who said, you need to leave the tech industry entirely. These things just don't mix. Or, no, you should go back to work, make a really short leave, as short as possible, so you can get right back in there and not have a gap. And when I decided to work from home for 4 years so I could be close to my kids, well, I got opinions on that too. And ultimately, I realized that it's not broken to be a software developer and a happy-go-lucky young woman and a mother of 2 kids and someone who still likes to go out dancing and a C-suite executive all at once. What's broken is that this is unusual at all. We need to make room for women to be goofy and fun-loving and imperfect, and they need to be wives and sisters and mothers and friends. They need to be able to be all of these things at once without being crushed by that excruciating pressure to fit into a box that somebody else made. And we need to start by making that room in just one woman inside ourselves. So thank you so much for coming to our conference today. I'm so glad you're here, and I can't wait for what's ahead.